Hey, it's Drybear. Continue our series of covering every single weapon in the First Descendant, and we are almost done. We're down to the last few weapons. Today we're going to be talking about the ultimate sniper rifle, Piercing Light. Now, when I first started theory crafting this weapon, I was convinced that it was going to be very similar to the Afterglow sword, and after spending a good amount of time getting my head wrapped around it, this is probably one of the weirdest weapons in the game as it comes to stat weightings and optimizing DPS. And that's because it has a astronomically high base firearm attack. At level 100, it's 193,000 as its base firearm attack. It has a 40% crit rate, which is decent for a sniper rifle, and 1.2, so 120% crit damage, which is abysmal for a sniper rifle. Most of these are much, much higher, so 1.2 crit damage for a sniper rifle is quite bad. However, it has an amazing weak point damage at 200% or 2x. Those two things, the weak point damage being exceptionally high and the base firearm attack being exceptionally high, creates this idea that is actually backwards of what you want to do, which we're going to talk about for the weapon itself. Now we go to the unique ability. It does give you some extra penetration, which is quite nice. It has a dispel effect, so it will remove buffs from enemies. This is excellent against Pyromaniac, Executioner, any boss that you fight that has a self buff that is very good to remove. This weapon is great at doing so. And it has a very conditional passive that is kind of odd and really inconsistent to get going. And that is when you pierce 2 or more targets, all of your shots, all of your hits in that shot will be guaranteed crits and have a little bit of crit damage on them. So let me show you what I mean by this. You'll have the piercing light out, and if you hit multiple targets, because you can pierce through them, if you hit multiple targets with your shot, every hit of it is a guaranteed crit and will give a little bit more crit damage, right? So if I go here, it's very unlikely my shot crits because it's not the highest crit chance of the sniper rifles, but if I'm able to line it up, every hit is a crit. This does have its applications. It can be useful when ads are on screen. Generally, sniper rifles are best for a single target, like taking out commanders, elites, and especially Colossus. There's not that many opportunities you're going to get in a Colossus fight in order to penetrate one target and hit the Colossus as well. When you see the little mobs that spawn, sometimes you can line the mob up in front of you and aim at the Colossus that way and get some damage out of it. But realistically, keeping high uptime or high usage on this passive is very, very minimal. You're not going to be able to do this all that often. It's just kind of part of the weapon and does have its applications as long as you're aware of using it. Now on screen, I have the quick swap build for the Afterglow sword. And this is basically a build where you plan to shoot only a couple times with the weapon and then swap back to your main weapon. And it takes advantage of the very conditional modules that have a cooldown, like dopaminergic sight, weak point expansion, and also strengthened first shot. All of these have very conditional high burst value on the module, and then they instantly turn off and go on internal cooldown, and they don't give you any value for usually 10 to 15 seconds, depending on the module. So if you wanted to run this with the piercing light, you could. However, from what I've seen and what I've tested and all the testing I've done, the piercing light is actually going to fall short of the Afterglow sword quite significantly with a maxed build, and it's because it scales much, much worse with critical strikes. It doesn't have that extra scaling from crit damage that you would need. And Afterglow sword not only has a slightly lower weak point, but way better crit damage scaling and better crit chance, but it also has the ability to scale up its weak point to catch up with piercing light, which when you're talking about even just a couple of shots, the Afterglow sword, when maxed out and used for this build, will outperform the piercing light. The build that I'm going to recommend for piercing light is going to sound counterintuitive, and it does sound weird, but I think the best build for the piercing light is actually going to take advantage of Descendant roll. The reason I say this and why I say it's so unbelievably confusing is because the base damage on the weapon is so unbelievably high and the weak point damage is so unbelievably high, you actually get more value out of trying to shoot more than you do out of trying to make each shot better. And I hope that makes sense as an explanation, because it's really what's happening with this weapon. You have so much as a base value that if you shot twice and put more effort into shooting more often, you would get better damage throughput than if you tried to make that one hit crit really hard. And it's because you're fighting against the current in this case, because the crit damage starts at 1.2, the crit chance is 40, but the crit damage isn't much more than normal damage when you crit, that expending all of these extra opportunities to try and get better insight or, focus insight, all this extra crit chance, you're actually better off just shooting more often with this weapon because it's already scaled so well at its base value. So what does Descendant Roll do, and why does it work so well for this weapon specifically? Because keep in mind that we're swapping out, this is probably maybe one other time we've been able to swap out a special category mod for a mod that didn't inherently apply damage, right? Because we're talking about Real Life Fighter, Elemental Conductor, Dopaminergic Activate, Special Sight, Weak Point Expansion. All of these add raw damage to the weapon. How is it possible that a mod that doesn't inherently add damage outperforms these other mods that don't? So what Descendant Roll does when it's maxed out is it gives you a free reload when you roll. So when this fully maxed out, you have a 100% chance to automatically refill your weapon to max rounds when you roll with a 15-second cooldown. So it is a little bit longer of a cooldown than things like Strengthen First Shot or things like Dopaminergic or even a Weak Point Expansion, which, by the way, Weak Point Expansion is pretty good on this weapon because it does have high weak point. But the big thing here with this weapon is that you're able to roll this, you'll get this ammo, and then when you roll, you're able to fill the entire clip, which means you could effectively play Piercing Light as if you were Glay without a reload. If you run any kind of rounds like Expand Weapon Charge, something like that, you can get upwards of 16 shots without needing to reload on this weapon, which means that you can just roll into weak point after weak point after weak point after weak point, and you can just keep hitting it and hitting it. And even if you miss the weak point, it's not the end of the world. You still have incredible base damage. And in this case, you actually end up wanting to shoot rapidly, effectively, and more often with Fire Rate and Descendant Roll because the base damage is so high. Now, if they end up doing some kind of balance change to this, where they try to bring it more in line with Afterglow Sword or Different Dream or Forest Gaze, that is more of a normal stat profile, I hope they don't, because it's nice to have weapons that are so unique like this one. But if they end up changing that and the base damage comes down and the weak point base comes down and it actually gets more crit scaling like most sniper rifles have, then it obviously would fit closer to the Afterglow builds. And of course, I'll have those up on here as well if you wanted to reference that. So you end up having this as your base build for Real Life Fighter, and you also have a quick swap build for Afterglow Sword that you can use, switch the weapon, fire max like 4 or 5 times because it falls off really hard after that, and then you want to switch off the weapon to get rid of it. You shoot once, reload to get the bonus, get that bonus, swap off the weapon and be done with it. You even have reload built into the normal build because we do want to have some reliability on the weapon. But with the Piercing Light, because you already have such a high value at base, modifying it becomes less valuable than trying to just maximize its uptime or maximize its usage, because it's already so good by itself that the stat weightings shift a bit on that. So if you look at the left side of the screen, for this build specifically on Piercing Light, we have Descendant Roll at the top, Strengthen First Shot, Real Life Fighter, Weak Point Expansion, and Elemental Conductor. This assumes you're going to use 2 full magazines, so you empty the magazine, roll to trigger Descendant Roll, empty the magazine, and then swap off the weapon. That gives you anywhere from 12 to 16 shots in a row without interruption, with no reload, no downtime. You're just firing, getting extra damage out of that and bursting it down. That is a play style, obviously, so if you don't want to play that way, you could certainly run the quick swap. The quick swap version of Piercing Light that is like this is about 1.517 on DPS. So the burst DPS for the quick swap is a little bit lower than just this Descendant Roll build, which is kind of cool. But it's not too far off, right? So it's like 80,000 DPS less than this. So if you wanted to run like a quick swap, you certainly could. You still will get high numbers with this. So if you run like a Sharon build with shot focus and her shield conversion, or if you had high damage conversion on weapon or single burst for that, you still will see high numbers. But if the fight lasts longer than 0.6 seconds, which every fight does if you're fighting a Colossi, then you're going to get way more value out of just trying to fire the weapon as much as possible. It's almost in the realm of like an auto sniper in scaling, just because of the way the stats are distributed. What's interesting about this too is that because the base firearm attack and the base Weak point is so unbelievably high without any modification. This is probably the first weapon that I can remember, at least, where fire rate is the second best stat on the stat priority. Firearm attack is usually first because it's the global scalar, but fire rate actually beat out all of these other stats here for stat weighting because it's already so good out of the box. Like, factory settings on the piercing light already does so much damage, you get a lot of value of just trying to shoot more because you just want to hit more with the crazy stats this have. Then we have LE damage from firearm attack, which is your elemental enhancement, weak point, crit damage, crit chance rounds, and reload. And again, if you wanted to, you could swap out better insight and focus fire on the end here for things like max rounds on high power, rounds conversion is always really nice. This allows you to convert extra rounds in the other types into high power, so you can have more ammo for it, or you could also run like expand weapon charge so you can fire more since you have an auto reload built into the build. And again, if you don't like this playstyle or you don't believe in it, you can very easily just run a quick swap build, or you can even run this the general Afterglow sword build. This will probably be on 1.4 million DPS on the general sniper rifle build. And of course, that's not terrible. 1.4 million DPS on any weapon is exceptionally high. That's still incredibly high in the game, and you could run that if you want to run this way, but I would encourage you to try something like this because there's no other weapon that I've encountered that has enough of a profile that matches this kind of chaos and this kind of playstyle, which is super unique to the piercing light because it has such high stats. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.